Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. I'm so happy to see all these wonderful, familiar faces and some new friends too. My name is Robin Rehack McGinnis, and I'm the Global Director of Development for Policy here at the Nature Conservancy. And I've been I live here in New Jersey, so I'm coming to you right from our home state of New Jersey. And I've been a part of the Nature Conservancy for 14 and a half years, 11 and a half of which with the great team in New Jersey. So it's a really, really wonderful for me to be here with you all today. And the topic of today's event, as you know, is climate and conservation, policy opportunities on the global, national, and state level. And we're going to be hearing today from three of our policy leaders at TNC. First up will be Cameron Onley. She's our North America Director of Policy and Government Relations, followed by Stacy McCormack, New Jersey Government Relations Manager, and Trina Malik, our New Jersey Climate and Energy Manager. And the Nature Conservancy's work to inform, educate, collaborate, and inspire some extremely impactful and sometimes pretty technical policy decisions and public funding decisions that are essential to achieve the goals of our shared conservation agenda. And we do this work at multiple levels, globally, nationally, here in the US and in many other countries, and here at the state level. Now I'd like to introduce you to Cameron Onley, our Director of North American Policy and GR for the Nature Conservancy. Prior to joining the Nature Conservancy, Cameron was Associate Vice President with PBS&J, an environmental engineering firm focused on large-scale ecosystem restoration. Most notably, Cameron held the position of Acting Assistant Secretary for Water and Science at the Department of the Interior during the George Bush administration, where she provided policy development, management, and oversight to the projects and programs of the Bureau of Reclamation and the U.S. Geological Survey. She also served as the principal advisor to the Interior Department Secretary and Deputy Secretary on significant environmental policy issues, such as Everglades restoration, Western water issues, and ocean and coastal matters. Furthermore, Cameron served as the Associate Director for Environmental Policy at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. She received a BS in Economics from Seattle University and a Master's in Agricultural Economics from Clemson University. So I'd like to turn this over now to Cameron. Thank you, Cameron.
Great, thank you. And thank you for inviting me here today and everybody spending an hour on policy. We love it. So I hope I can leave you excited and energized about policy. Start with a happy St. Patrick's Day. One of the benefits from working from home now, the office being closed, is that I could start the corned beef is in the crock pot and we're starting to smell it in the house. So my daughter is super excited. I already told some of your team there that you're gonna have to bear with me. My husband and my daughter, I've asked them both to shh, and they're doing well, but we're all managing at home together. So I'm hoping my dogs will be quiet. So we hope. So today I just wanted to spend some time with you on, I was going to talk to you about how we make our policy decisions, spend a little bit of time with you resurfacing some big conservation victories of 2020, many of which you may have helped us get. And then talk with you, use a case study to again, further how we do our work. And then I'll end with what we see as our top policy priorities moving into the coming year, the coming Congress, both with Congress and the Biden administration. First slide, please. So our approach to public policy, and all of you know us so very well, we have large challenges ahead of us in nature, for people, for nature. And one of the things our leadership has really been pushing us to do is to think more transformationally. So move away from transactional to move to transformational approaches where we can make a bigger, larger scale impact on the problems that we all know very well that are facing our country. doing those transformational measures, a lot of those are the opportunities lie within policy, whether it's lobbying for a particular bill or working on the bill and its implementation into agencies, wherever that tool set is, or those rules of the game, whether it's in the federal agencies or down in your state, your local. How do we work with policy to try to address these larger challenges in a much more holistic and large scale way? Next slide, please. So you're very well aware, as we approach all of our issues, policy is no different. We lead with our science. We are science informed. I have to say that this offers the credibility that we have with elected officials, gives us a lot of credibility. Just, I think it was 2 years ago, a case in point is we had Dr. Joe Fargione testify before Congress. I think he was one of 4 witnesses in about a 3-hour testimony on his natural climate science solutions, you know, the NCS work and the science behind that. It was about 3 hours, and he got about 80% of the questions. And some of the members of Congress started referring to him as Dr. Joe. And just that engagement, leading with that information, so valuable to us as your lobbyists, as your policy folks, to make sure that we're using our science to inform the policy, and we're more and more being turned to for that. We work across the aisles in order to achieve durable, long-lasting policy solutions. This is a goal of ours. Most things in Congress do not stay, do not last, unless there are at least some members of Congress on either side and championing, signing on, working with. Doesn't have to be 50-50, but it does need to be a bipartisan approach. And then solutions oriented. Again, that feeds right into our practical matter. We want to work across the aisles to get things that are durable, long lasting. We also want to lead with our science. I'll share with you, and maybe some of you experienced this if you've been to our advocacy days. You know, when we wear our pin up there or the stickers that say TNC, I cannot tell you the number of times that actual members of Congress will stop and say, oh, you're that group. You're the group that gets stuff done. And that is just tremendous to hear. And that is from both Democrats and Republicans. So to be known as the group that gets stuff done on the ground and nationally is really incredible, is an incredible feat. Next slide, please. I wanted to put this down because we rely so heavily on our state chapters, on the work that we do on the ground, on seeing how policies and the intent of some policies might hit the projects. Did it work? Did it not work? And so as we develop our agenda and look for where the opportunities are to advance our policy priorities, it's really that back and forth that we have not only with New Jersey, but across the 50 states. So we're working in partnership to kind of elevate where we see we need changes from the policy arena, but also for my team, like really focusing on where do we have those opportunities to advance the policies that are aligned with our shared conservation agenda. Next slide, please. And this one, I looked up something because there is never there are always more opportunities in a Congress to work on issues than we have time for. I looked at a piece of data. I was trying to, in the last Congress, so January 3rd, 2019 to January 3rd, 2021, there were 16,601 pieces of legislation introduced into Congress. That was a high, but when I did a quick scan of the last 8 Congresses, it was around 10 to 13,000 every Congress. Granted, this is not all our issues, I get that, but I say this in that there are so many bills that are introduced, and how we, either bills and then working with administrations too, so many opportunities. We really have to be decisive about what are our biggest opportunities and where do we use the Nature Conservancy's resources, our political voice, our political will, and our political push. And so these are 4 criteria, not in any order of preference, but things that we kind of talk through as a team when we're looking at the vast opportunities that we see. And so some of it is practical timeliness. Does this piece of legislation or this rule or this opportunity in a federal agency, is it going to happen this year? So the timeliness. Or just as importantly, is working on it this year about, will it lay that foundational move to move forward with something in later years? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. The feasibility, is, again, this is kind of that solid foundation, is there support for movement, whether the political support, what kind of support are we seeing from the committees, what kind of support are we seeing from specific members of Congress who have more, whose opinions weigh a little bit more than others. So we kind of look at that, like, is it really going to move forward? TNC contribution is another one that we have worked in so many great partnerships. I know New Jersey does, but all across the country and us nationally. So where does our voice really matter? Where are we going to make the difference in engaging on an issue? It's something we talk about because there's so many good, where do we need to lead versus where can we also just be a partner? So those are conversations that we go through to make sure that we're utilizing our work or utilizing our resources as best as possible. And then the last one is leverage. And this goes to how are those policy opportunities aligning with our 2030 organizational goals, our North America shared conservation goals. So where do we see those biggest policy levers that we can pull that are going to get us our biggest outcomes, conservation outcomes? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So I want to just take a minute, as we look forward to 2021, I wanted to pause and just acknowledge the successes that we had in 2020, the achievements that we made under some of the most challenging political situations that we have faced in my lifetime, maybe not ever, but as well as, COVID. And so what was going on in our country was really difficult. And even during all this time, during all those challenges, we were able to get some of the most historic pieces of legislation passed. And otherwise, what everything you would have read said they weren't going to do anything. They couldn't do anything. They were broken. A lot of that stuff but we were able to see the Great American Outdoors Act. This is the act that permanently reauthorized the Land and Water Conservation Fund at $900 million a year, and also invested $1.9 billion for a 5-year period into our parks and into other public lands across the nation. And that was done in a truly bipartisan way. I'm going to use that as my case study to kind of talk to you a little bit later about Land and Water Conservation Funds. So I won't go into too much detail. Next slide, please. Bristol Bay, I know I heard that you had Steve Cohn come on and talk to you about the Bristol Bay work in the state of Alaska, and just such a tremendous win for us last year. You heard this system is someday, I've never been to Alaska yet, someday I hope to take my family. But the Bristol Bay area is about roughly the size of Ohio. It's enormously it's an intact ecological area. And it has wild rivers, vast big lakes, tundra, forests, wetlands. I'm sure you heard and you saw all the pretty pictures from Steve. And its streams and rivers produce 40% of the global wild salmon. And it's really the last home to the last wild salmon. And it's the stronghold for the North America. And I think notably and as important, it's home to 31 sovereign indigenous nations. Peoples there who have been working for over 10,000 years on continuous stewardship, both rooted with their cultural aspect as well as their economic aspect. And it's all at the center of salmon there. I'm from Seattle, so we kind of get some of that in Seattle, but I've never been up to Alaska. So for years, TNC, used our science, informed that process that was going forward in Bristol Bay. It's been under threat for mining, for gold, for copper, for other minerals for a long time. It has, gone through the regular administrative process. It was stopped under Obama in 2014 in the Obama administration. That started up again, or that rule was reversed under the Trump administration. And so as we weighed in with our science and with our relationships with the Army Corps of Engineers, it became clear that what was coming out of the Army Corps, what we thought in our information was coming out, is that we needed to use our voice nationally. It's an Alaska issue, yes, but it's a nationally significant place that we needed to weigh in. And we did. We weighed in with working with the members of Congress, both Alaska as well as congressional, and then working with the White House and White House staff and making it known where we stood on this issue. And it was reversed. It was a huge Herculean effort by a lot of partners. You heard that from Steve, but it was one of those areas that I highlight because we made it a conscious decision to move into that at a critical point where we thought our voice really mattered because partners were coming to us saying, can you help? Can you help? it's not the last we're going to see of Bristol Bay. They're going to be, or threats to Bristol Bay. We have a lot to work to do in the state to make sure that those mining rights don't come up again and really have to get that permanent protection. And we're going to be working in the state of Alaska to do that. But in 2020, being able to get that one change, that permit pulled and rejected was huge. Next slide, please. Late December, I'm sure most of you, as we should, and Congress was very focused late December last year on COVID relief, making sure that our hospitals and the people that were on the front lines working to help our nation with COVID got the resources they needed. So that really took the bulk of appropriately took the bulk of the work at the end of last year. But they also, as a body, have to pass appropriations bills. Sometimes you'll hear it called omnibus bills. A lot of times, because we've just gotten out of what I would say regular order, you run up to the end of the year and you end up with a run and you get these big bills that are multiple spending bills, they're called, bundled together. So we knew we were running into that. We also knew that it offers an opportunity to move forward with some of the other policies that we had been working on for either a number of years or a number of Congresses. And so we've been working on clean energy provisions, many bipartisan clean energy provisions through the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. And we saw those in the omnibus bill. We pushed, we made phone calls, we made the case as to why it should be included, and along with others, again, but our voice was added to that. And we've got a historic, it was the best clean energy bill we'd seen in a decade, with phase outs of the greenhouse gases, development of new carbon-free technologies, extension of clean energy tax incentives, all these provisions that we had been working with, they're vital to our overall climate strategy. Next slide, please. And then the Water Resources Development Act, an act that authorizes the Army Corps of Engineers to all of your big water projects. This is a bill that is on general regular order, so maybe every 2 years it happens, and sometimes it slips, but we have been working on this provisions in order to advance natural infrastructure for a number of years. And every year we get a little more. And in this one that was passed in the big omnibus bill, the lawmakers actually did expand the investment in natural resources in there. And we saw some policies that directly direct the Army Corps of Engineers towards more resilient nature-based approaches. And so we worked on those levers too, and they were moved forward in December. So I share all these with you, one, because I want a chance, I wish we could celebrate with you. I hope everybody raises a glass at some point, but also just to demonstrate the strength of the team and the organization moving into the next Congress, moving into what we did the next very challenging political years, but our ability to navigate through that and see successes was really shown in 2020, a lot of which we are highly dependent on our trustees, our donors, every state chapter in order to make sure that these things happen. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just take a moment to share the Land and Water Conservation Fund story. All of you are probably very well aware of it, but maybe you're not aware of how long it took us to get that success. So I mentioned, our final success was in the Great American Outdoors Act, where we saw that permanent funding at $900 million a year to go to conservation. That didn't come overnight. That in fact took almost over a decade to do. And so I like to tell folks this story mostly because policy work does take so long. It can take a number of Congresses. And even when you know a program is going to expire, you need to back up from there and start planning to build that political will, build those champions on Capitol Hill, navigate dynamics you might have with an administration in order to see something happen. And so it was about, before 2010, we started planning the campaign for this reauthorization, and because it was going to expire in 2015. For those who don't know the program, I'll just briefly say it. It's a program that was in the 50s, 50 years ago, in the 60s was actually, it was developed in order, this pretty simple concept. We were pulling energy offshore from offshore oil and gas. Part of those revenues should go to onshore conservation. So something, a resource that belongs to us all, should pay for some of the conservation that we need through the country. And it's been a very successful program. Most every national park has an LWCF component. Lots of state parks have an LWCF component. It really has helped us advance over the years conservation in this country. I will say it was, authorized way back when at 900 million, but it was never permanently authorized. So that means every appropriation process, we had to go in and fight for appropriation levels we wanted Congress to give us. And it always ranged around 300 to 400 million. So our goal was to make sure it didn't expire so we could continue. We really wanted permanent reauthorization of that 900 million. And we started to build those champions, those political champions, and really needed at the time, back in 2010 to 2011, really needed a Republican at the time to champion for us. The Senate and the House were controlled by Republicans, and we worked really hard to get Senator Burr to stand up for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and to bring more of his colleagues, his Republican colleagues and his across the aisle colleagues, to support the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And so we also knew, because we were working in the Obama administration, we needed to get the Obama administration supportive also. And we were luckily enough to have Sally Jewell, who was the secretary at the time. Tom Kors on my team had a relationship with Senator Burr, took him out, walked with him, really convinced him of the importance of LWCF. And then he invited Sally Jewell on a hike with the senator. We can't do that right now because of COVID, but really fostered a friendship between the two of them to work hard during that administration to get reauthorization, to not allow it to expire. Many of you or our trustees went to Capitol Hill for us, before 2014, 2015, advocating for us to not let it expire. We did op-eds, we did membership drives, we did a lot of things that the organization had not traditionally done in advocacy. So stretching our advocacy and policy muscles a bit. And it still expired in September 2015. Got it really close, and it still expired. Months later, it did get a 3-year extension. But I just share that with you because as many failures as one might have on a piece of legislation or a piece of policy, it's getting it a little bit further in the policy pipeline, if you want to call that. Next slide, please. So fast forward almost we got the extension 3 years. It was literally the next day my team and we started talking about, well, now we have to continue with the campaign because it takes that long to get that permanent. It was going to expire in 2018. So we continued building the partnerships, doing the hearings, writing the letters, getting the group letters, working in coalition, having outdoor, press conferences, things like that, just to elevate the issue within America. We did op-eds across our country from all of our state chapters, wrote op-eds talking about why didn't it matter to this state? Why didn't it, what has it done? And so we continued that drumbeat, for lack of a better term, to really move forward with making sure it didn't expire yet again. I'll move to the next one because I think I'm running out of time. So fast forward to March of 2020, still looking for authorization or permanent funding and reauthorization. This is right in the middle. March 2020 was just when we were starting to see shutdowns happen throughout the country related to COVID. And we were on Capitol Hill up on the right side. Capitol Hill, that's Sally Jewell, who at the time was our acting CEO, with 8 members of Congress, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, in a room with environmental groups, conservation groups like ourselves, saying, this is the time. We have to get this done. We need to focus and get this done. And it was a little bit of a rallying cry for the conservation groups to band together, not to fight with one another against, the maintenance backlog versus LWCF, but really come together, unite us as a larger coalition to say, let's get this done. A week later, 56 senators, bipartisan, introduced a bill that included permanent reauthorization and funding for Land and Water Conservation Fund, as well as that 1.9 billion for the backlog in our national parks that I mentioned earlier. So the game wasn't over then. And this, I want to tell you, we were in the middle of shutting down our offices, your team here, your teams across the country were moving home when we were on big conference calls with members of Congress, on doing the best we could now that we couldn't go in person, to continue to advocate for this work, because they were still doing their jobs. There was a pause a little bit, so we had to work within that new dynamic. We had a Secretary Jewel, she had a Zoom call for with members of Congress, with I think like 180 groups, attendees, with all the senators. Later, I guess it was closer to June. At that time, I might be getting my timetable wrong, but closer to June, just that briefing saying we can get this done even during these COVID times when we had to do everything Zoom call. We can get this done. We had our trustees calling members of Congress. We had our board calling members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans. Keep this on the front burner. We can get this done this year. And it really was a full court press into making sure that we were writing op-eds. We organized a letter with all the past secretaries of the Interior signing a letter, both Democrats and Republican parties signing the letter that is vital to get the Land and Water Conservation Fund redone. So even during those challenging times, we were able to push it forward. We had trustees reaching out to the White House at the time to lay that foundation of why this is so important. Let's get it done. And it was signed into law in August of 2020. So I share that with you because the story, I wanted to just impress upon you that policy work can take decades. I read once in a report that said minimum of 3 Congresses. So that's 6 years to move a piece of legislation. And that's minimum. And most of them take a lot longer. So it's that continuous drumbeat, the understanding of the politics as it shifts, as it has a lot during the who controls the chambers, who controls the White House, and being able to navigate through that in order to keep that push going, and that push for these big wins. So I will move to the next slide, please. So I'm going to touch on the global policy goals. They're very similar to what I'm going to talk to you about our U.S. policy goals. We have climate. Our global team, and this is run by Andrew Deutz. He's my counterpart and does the outside the U.S. policy work. He and his team are working hard to embed nature-based solutions in countries' climate plans. They're also have embraced, over the last 3 years, continuing to embrace the biodiversity goals of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. And with that, the 30 by 30 goals there, and they continue to push forward there even in these times where they can't gather. And I'd say in the public funding, the one area that the US folks, my team plays with this team in particular is how do we advocate for, with coalitions, but with specific members of Congress, US members on appropriations committees who actually fill the USAID bucket, fill the Global Environmental Facility bucket, make sure the State Department and other international programs have that money to move forward. And Andrew's always teasing me. He's like, your team gets us the money, we go spend it. And I'm like, okay. But if you have any more questions on that, I really would encourage you to reach out to Andrew or maybe have a presentation, because what we're doing globally is absolutely fascinating also. Next slide, please. So next 3 slides, I'm really going to cover, and I think I'm running out of quite a bit of time. So I'm going to cover our top policy opportunities that we see in the coming year. We do continue to see climate opportunities. We've embraced a net zero carbon emissions by 2050. We have seen lots of support, obviously, from the new administration. So we're looking at how we advance climate, our climate work through administrative policies within the agencies, as well as continuing to advance clean energy, technology advancements, tax, if that makes sense, legislation in order to advance our US climate and clean energy platform. Next slide, please. We have also in the US embraced the biodiversity goals that have been set globally through the UN Convention. But for the first time, looking at it, to restore and protect 30% of America's lands and waters. We've been working closely. So this is You probably heard from the Biden administration, one of their big priorities, and we've been working closely with them. As soon as he was announced as the winner, we started working with their teams to talk with them. What do you mean by, this 30 by 30 goal? What does it mean in the US context? So how do we broaden for the US that it's both restoration and working landscapes as well as protection? So a large toolkit that we can advance in order to get conservation done in the United States, especially given just the dynamics of our country. Next slide. And the last but not least is infrastructure and stimulus. So over the last number of years during the Trump administration, during and then as we moved into COVID, there was a lot of conversations about infrastructure and stimulus bills. Obviously, strong concerns as COVID continues to hit our country, the impact on our economy that it is having. And now looking, and we see the Congress, because we're talking with committees, shifting their attention after this last relief bill to what can we do from an infrastructure standpoint? So maybe a big transition, or sorry, a big transportation bill. How do we use bills like that, or use opportunities to stimulate the economy, to get our nation back to work? And what our job here, and what we've been trying to do, both within the administration, the Biden administration, as well as on Capitol Hill, is how does nature play a role in that? How do we ensure when we're developing our big transportation projects that we have resilient transportation projects, that they're resilient to nature? How do we ensure that clean energy is part of that Build Back Better, as we've heard the president say? How do we make the case that large natural systems like forest restoration, forest protection, but restoration and management are actually really important to stimulate our economy? So those have been that we've sent up a pretty expansive letter that outlines multiple opportunities that we see to help stimulate the economy as it relates to infrastructure, and we're continuing to work that with committees as they're drafting bills right now. But everything we do, and rightly so, members of Congress want to know, how is this going to help the communities in my area? How, what are the job numbers? It's not the one and only thing they need to know, but it's part of the conversation. And so we see a big opportunity to advance a lot of our conservation goals there, as well as our climate and clean energy goals are in that bucket of infrastructure and stimulus. So with that, I think I'm finished. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cameron. Next up is Stacy McCormick.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stacy McCormick, and I am the Government Affairs Manager for the Nature Conservancy New Jersey chapter. I've been at TNC for a little over 2 years, but I've been working on environmental policy and specifically climate adaptation policy for a few decades. My work here at TNC includes lobbying at the federal level on our federal policy priorities, working with the New Jersey team to develop the state policy agenda, and lobbying in Trenton on our priorities. Today, I want to talk a little bit about what is happening at the state level as it pertains to climate adaptation policy. On January 27th, 2020, Governor Murphy signed Executive Order 100, directing the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection to develop comprehensive climate adaptation and emissions reductions regulations. What this means is that New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection has been mandated to make sweeping regulatory reforms to existing rules that impact our environment so that we can be more resistant to the impacts of climate change. These regulations are developed under the banner NJ Pact, New Jersey Protecting Against Climate Threats. Next slide. Updating these rules through the public process of rulemaking provides a huge opportunity for the New Jersey chapter to implement our climate adaptation policy priorities developed in 2019. Our adaptation policy priorities include prioritizing nature-based solutions where possible, meaning, for example, restoration of marshes along the coast and installation of green infrastructure in our cities, securing funding for coastal projects, which is one of the best ways we can that we can be sure that nature-based solutions are implemented, is to create sustainable funding to pay for them. And lastly, coordinating land use planning efforts between state, county, and municipal governments so that they're planning together for climate change events. Next slide. So what is TNC doing now to move our agenda forward and take advantage of this huge opportunity? Since TNC is recognized as a subject matter expert in the area of resilience, we're often invited into NJDEP to discuss our tools, science, and our policy recommendations. Updating these rules through a public process like this comes along once in a lifetime. This is a unique opportunity because the administration specifically wants to see forward-thinking climate change data and projections incorporated into the rules that govern land use decisions. The other unique piece of NJ-PACT initiative is that these rules are being done in conjunction with other state guidance documents to help local governments become more resilient. Currently, we have a partnership with American Littoral Society to craft extensive comments to be submitted to the department during the upcoming formal comment period. And lastly, we are consistently engaging with the department on the ever-shifting timeline for this rulemaking. We understand the unfortunate conditions that we're working under with COVID, but we also need to do our part as advocates to be sure that the process doesn't slip too far away, especially in an election year, as attention can easily turn towards other issues. And as Carmen had previously mentioned, these types of changes can take decades, so we need to stay on top of the decision makers and express the urgency in this work.
Thank you so much, Stacy. Next up is Trina Malik.
Robin. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So good afternoon. My name is Trina Malik. I'm the Climate Change and Energy Policy Manager here in the New Jersey chapter. And my job is to advocate for the strongest possible climate change and energy policies in the state of New Jersey. So where do we begin? Next slide, please. So we begin with New Jersey's carbon footprint, which is the largest share by far is from the transportation sector. That's for New Jersey and our neighboring states and in the entire United States right now, where the largest carbon footprint is from transportation. In New Jersey specifically, it's 42%. In the building sector, it's 33%, and the energy sector is 19%. Next slide, please. So how do we go about doing our work and advocating for policies that will reduce emissions in New Jersey? We work very collaboratively with a diverse group of environmental, business, community, and other types of organizations. New Jersey is very lucky. It has a very large group of advocates working towards these common goals. So we work collaboratively together so that we work the most efficiently to achieve these goals. Cross-cutting to all of our state policy work is a focus on climate justice and this has always been the case, the opportunity for economic growth and job creation. However, now with COVID and the economic devastation that it's incurred in New Jersey, it's all the more important to focus on economic growth, job creation, and climate justice. So we also look at other co-benefits such as public health and increased quality of life. Next slide, please. So going back to the biggest part of the carbon footprint, the transportation sector. Some of you may have heard me speak before or read it in some of our literature, but a big priority of the Nature Conservancies is the Transportation and Climate Initiative. It's a regional mechanism, it's a market-based mechanism to reduce emissions from the transportation sector. We do this with the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states and Washington, D.C. We had a big milestone last December where governors had the opportunity to sign an MOU to join the Transportation and Climate Initiative. Governor Murphy did not join. However, in my next slide, I'll tell you what he did announce the same day. But we're still very much at the table. His administration is very much at the table for joining Transportation and Climate Initiative. The states that did join are Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Washington, D.C. jurisdiction. The other thing we're doing, you may have heard of the Rutgers Climate Change Alliance. Some of our guests here may be members of the Rutgers Climate Change Alliance. They have various working groups, and I co-chair the Transportation Working Group in New Jersey. Next slide, please. When I mentioned that Governor Murphy said he wasn't at this time going to join the Transportation and Climate Initiative, he did propose 4 rules. So Stacy was just talking about rulemaking and how TNC comments were appropriate. So the 4 rules that he proposed in the transportation sector are: 1, to adopt California's advanced clean truck rule; 2, to adopt California's low NOx or nitrogen oxides rule; 3, to decarbonize port transportation; and 4, to require mandatory emissions testing. We have certain classes of trucks here, the medium to bigger ones, that didn't have mandatory emissions testing. So to have that mandated. We haven't seen the draft rules of these yet. They should be coming out within a month or 2. And then if appropriate, then the Nature Conservancy will be commenting on those to make sure they're as strong as possible. Next slide, please. So that takes us to the building sector, which accounts for 33% of our carbon footprint. Admittedly, in New Jersey, there hasn't been that much movement on this sector. More will be to come in 2021. However, one thing that actually the Nature Conservancy is co-leading on with the League of Conservation Voters is an effort to pass appliance standards, which if passed this year, then by 2026, I have listed out the savings that would be achieved. There's 17 appliances on this bill that would save electricity, gas, and water savings. And as I said, we're always looking at the economic benefits of the policies that we support. It would save households and businesses $132 million per year in 2026. That would rise to almost $400 million per year in 2035. So where the bill stands now is that it's been voted out of committee in the Assembly and out of committee in the Senate. I'm very happy to say it's a bipartisan piece of legislation. Our co-prime sponsor in the Senate is a Republican, and we're doing heavy outreach across the aisle so that we continue to get bipartisan support when the vote is up for the floor in both the Assembly and the Senate, which should be happening in the next couple of months. I mentioned the Rutgers Climate Change Alliance and that I co-chair the Transportation Working Group. Next week, the Rutgers Climate Change Alliance will be launching its Zero Energy Collaborative. So that'll be looking at codes and standards and other mechanisms to reduce the carbon footprint of buildings. And so I will be in that working group, working with them through this year to see how we can reduce the carbon footprint from buildings in New Jersey. And with that, thank you very much. I will turn it over to Sue for questions. Thank you.
Okay, Trina, the first question is for you. What's the biggest challenge to achieving 100% clean energy in New Jersey?
Okay, well, there's a lot that makes me hopeful that we will achieve it. The biggest challenge, I would say, is time. Climate activists all over the world go by IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Studies. That's the science that leads our work. And they say we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030. I've been doing climate change for a couple of decades now. 2030 seems very far off. It's now almost 8.5 years away. And so the scale and urgency of how to reduce emissions and achieve 100% clean energy is probably our biggest challenge. We can definitely get it done. It's the time factor, I would say. But again, I'm hopeful in New Jersey because we have a very collaborative group of advocates. We work very collaboratively with so-called opposition, but we discuss with them, we have calls with them, and so that we can come up with solutions that are mutually beneficial.
Thanks. I just want to remind everyone to just type your questions right into the chat and we'll continue to answer. Cameron, I have one for you. Given the political divide currently in the United States, how do you anticipate getting anything done?
I appreciate that question. Thank you. I mentioned that, last year we were definitely in a politically divided country, and I never thought we'd see the margins that we see currently in the Senate and in the House. So it's definitely difficult to move things forward, but I do see right now at least on our issues, interest in working across the aisle and interest in moving things forward. So, will we see big bills? Maybe not done in this Congress, but what is really as important is that we're having those conversations about laying the groundwork for the things we want to see done in either this Congress, if we can get it done, but moving into next Congress and next year, and just keep pushing forward, because it takes those years education, of writing of letters, of hearings, of the whole bandwidth of education, and keeping our issues front and center on members' mind. And I will say, you know, members like to pass laws, so they will be passing something in probably in an infrastructure transportation bill, because they'll want to return. So, you know, our engagement in those big bills are going to be really important. And then, you know, the administration, I say we have a lot of opportunities, more than I think we've ever thought we would have, and working with them on the administrative processes, policies that they are trying to advance in agencies. We're already reaching out to USDA, those who have political appointees, talking to them about how we can advance our conservation, whether it's in the climate arena or landscape, lands, waters, in those agencies. So taking it from an administrative front also.
Thanks, Cameron. You all spoke, this question is for the three of you. You all spoke about TNC making comments on legislation. Can you expand on that? What kinds of comments and what kinds of impacts?
I can get us started. One thing that's to a great advantage of the Nature Conservancies, there's many things, but one, for instance, I have a state climate policy job and I have counterparts in all of my neighboring states. I may have about 25, 30 counterparts across the country. I'm not sure what the accurate number is right now, but it's extremely helpful when I comment on New Jersey policies that I can learn from our neighboring states. I know best practices of what's already been done. I know what's on the horizon for those states. So collectively, we can comment in each of our states in a way that's very impactful and forward-looking and cutting edge because of the experience of our colleagues across the region. I work mostly with the New England and Mid-Atlantic states. So I would think that's one, and also TNC, we have our priorities, so I can lead with those. The other thing I'll say is that because we have a very strong federal team under the leadership of Cameron, that we know what's happening from the federal level. And so when that gives us some direction here at the state level as well. Leave it at that.
And yeah, at the federal level, we'll provide comments, formal comments, sometimes in the administrative process. So that might be there's a formal rulemaking to do something in the agency that we've engaged in, and we'll provide our scientific comments there. We'll do it through the regular formal process, but we'll also be, agencies have a lot of deference and a lot of things they can do. So we'll work within the agency to actually try to influence maybe, agency directives, whether it's a Fish and Wildlife Service directive on mitigation and mitigation rule sets. And so we'll work with those officials also where we can to influence and provide written materials. We provide written materials to the people who are writing that rule set, whether it's formally or informally, it's called. And then on the legislative front, we start with our big letters. Like I mentioned, our infrastructure letter, we just resent it in February 3rd. We have big buckets. It's a 10-page letter, much longer than we normally have, but areas that we see increased investment in, clean energy, energy issues, as well as conservation, that we think they should be considering in any infrastructure or stimulus bill. So we start at the big level, and then, committee came back to us as we've shared our letter. Different committees have come back to us and say, well, what did you mean by this? What language would you support here? Sometimes right now, that's what we're going through with them, is like, okay, what does that language, implementation in a bill language, actually look like? Have we supported this provision in a previous bill and we can just share with this congressional staffer, this is what we mean, or do we have to write something? And so it takes the form of both informal as well as formal processes.
I also just want to add on, the piece that I spoke about was our engagement around informal and formal comment periods for the New Jersey PACT initiative, just exactly what Cameron had just said. The Nature Conservancy had been invited into the department to speak to them as they were formulating the rules, which is part of the informal process, right? So that when they finally propose the rule, we know that it's a little bit more baked than most people would think. It's the proposed rule isn't going to change very much. So the engagement process changes as you're invited in. So as Cameron had just said, there's a formal process and then sort of an informal process, but because, you know, the Nature Conservancy has such great relationships with the department, we're often invited in while they're sort of thinking about what they're going to propose, which is an incredible place to be. Same situation on legislation. Oftentimes, as Cameron had also said, you know, they'll do a hearing. And just recently we were invited in, we were the only environmental group invited in to participate in a hearing where there was no piece of legislation up. And you could tell that they were just sort of thinking about what they wanted to do. Maybe there's an opportunity to like put together a package of bills. But to speak on, in this particular case, it was infrastructure and natural infrastructure. But we're often invited in to get into the beginning phases of bill creation or, you know, regulatory reform.
Thanks, Stacy. I have a question from Ann Jacobson, one of our trustees. She's the vice chair of our board, and she asks, for those of us trustees who don't have relationships with legislators, how can we be most helpful either at the federal or the state level?
I will say from the federal level, whether you have a close relationship with a member of Congress, can pick up a phone and call them. We love that, of course, but we also, because you're from the state, they are going to listen to you more than they're going to listen to a lobbyist or somebody who lives here. You're a constituent and your voice does matter to them. It's amazing. I've had conversations with now members of Congress who have retired or voted out or others. And well, Senator Frist, who sits on our global board, said it matters so much to have somebody from the state talking to them about what matters both to their state, but also nationally. They listen to you. And then I don't know what your background is necessarily, but you know, you all of our trustees are very accomplished people, and helping us out with, you know, if you come from a communications background, helping engage us on how we might better our communications. If you come from a lot of scientists I know on our boards are engaging our scientists, but using the gifts and talents that you have with us and working with us, it's actually something I've been talking some to Harry Drucker, who runs the chair of the chairs of the trustees. Like, how do we engage our trustees to help us tackle maybe some problems we even have internally? So I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Okay, one more for Trina, and I think this will be the last question. Trina, for the New Jersey carbon footprint, energy was the lowest of the 3 categories. Is this a recent change due to energy efficiency, or has that always been the case?
Okay, if Russ Fernari is still on the call, he's the best person to answer this. But we did have coal-fired power plants, more of them in the state. I don't know, we maybe have one left that's actually running, if that.
There is one, Trina.
Thank you.
I think it's Logan down in Penns Grove or whatever, down in Logan Township, down in South Jersey. It's
Okay.
a heat and power plant.
A peaking power plant. Okay. So right now, about 50% of our electricity comes from nuclear generation and about 50% comes from natural gas. There's maybe 2 to 3 that comes from renewable energy at the moment. That's obviously going to increase a lot more. With 7,500 megawatts of offshore wind coming onshore. We have a solar transition program. Some part of it is due to energy efficiency. Part of the Clean Energy Act is that we have 2.15% energy efficiency from electric utilities by, I believe, 2030 or 2035, and then 1.15% from gas utilities. But right now, we currently have less of our footprint from the energy sector, because about 50% of our electricity comes from nuclear and about 50% from natural gas.
Okay, and I know I said that was the last one, but we do have one more question if we have time. Will forest preservation and restoration be components of New Jersey climate regulations and funding initiatives?
Wait, can you repeat that?
Sue, can you please repeat the question?
Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. I apologize. Will forest preservation and restoration be components of New Jersey climate regulations and funding initiatives?
My quick answer, and I have to really think about how, my quick answer is that there is funding available for forest restoration through the RGGI funds, if I'm correct. I don't, the regional greenhouse gas emission funding, which is used to do restoration work. What I don't know is how much of it is going to go toward forest restoration because of the way calculations are done in order to acquire the money, if that makes sense. Without getting way down into the weeds of the program and how it's allocated, there's funding available, but it's a calculation of whether or not it's going to have a big impact as to whether or not the organization can acquire it.
Okay, that's it for questions.
Great. I just wanted to jump in and say a quick thank you to everyone for joining us today. As you can see, conservation, as you know, is a team sport, and policy even that much more so. So we really couldn't do the work that we do without all of our trustees and donors and friends and partners. As you've heard, you know, your work and support is really essential to the success that we've had to date and to helping us achieve even more in the years ahead at this critical time. So thank you so much. We really appreciate your commitment to conservation and your devotion to the Nature Conservancy. So thank you so much for coming, and you're welcome to stay and chat for a little bit, I think. I'll turn it over to Sue in terms of the timing, but I think we have a little time for some chat. Is that right?
Yep.
Great.
I'll just add my thank you. I do have to jump to another call. I really appreciate the opportunity. If I touched on anything that you want to know more about, please reach out to me. I have an amazing team of experts that can drill way down into the nitty gritty of the policy if any of it's interesting to you.